Good evening from New York. I'm Dan Rather with news, analysis, and commentary. And we begin with a quick welcome aboard to Oliver North, who was announced late today as the new president of the National Rifle Association, the NRA. You may remember North from the Iran-Contra scandal of the 1980s, when the Reagan administration secretly sent some of America's most technologically advanced weapons to the Ayatollah Khomeini in Iran, in exchange for a secret slush fund of cash to finance a shadowy war in Central America. North's conviction was later overturned, and he became a far-right pundit and Fox News regular. Now, when word first came that North was to be the new NRA president, there was surprise and some almost disbelief. Unbelievable was one quick popular reaction. This was based on an opinion held by some people questioning his competence and organizational skills. It's been said in some quarters that Oliver North is a man who couldn't operate a parking meter, that Oliver North couldn't organize a two-car motorcade. But arguing against that view is this. North was a former U.S. Marine officer who led other Marines in combat in Vietnam. High credentials for competence and courage. It turns out that North's new position doesn't actually involve running the NRA. That remains in basically the same hands as before. North's new role is more a ceremonial and public relations one, along the lines of that once held by the late actor Charlton Heston, whose final role was as a champion of a belligerent and polarizing gun culture.
I want to say those fighting words for everyone within the sound of my voice to hear and to heed, and especially for you, Mr. Gore. From my cold, dead hands.
So, what to make of North at the NRA? We'll see. Be interesting to observe how North does battle with all the young people seeking some common sense efforts to reduce gun violence, and how those young people in turn respond to him and what he represents. Well, now let's turn to this. It's tempting to see what happened with the Republican Party this week as an aberration, a one-off. How, after all, did a convicted criminal even get in the running to win the Republican Senate nomination in West Virginia? If you weren't familiar with Don Blankenship before now, you should know that he did a year in prison in connection with a disaster at one of his mines that killed 29 people. Blankenship had a vocal and consistent record of contempt for safety measures and for government oversight. But to really get a sense of this man, you should see his own ads. Blankenship doesn't go after Democrats. In his ad from last week, heading into Tuesday's Republican primary, Blankenship goes after Senate Republican leader Mitch McConnell.
Hi, I'm Don Blankenship, candidate for U.S. Senate, and I approve this message. Swamp Captain Mitch McConnell has created millions of jobs for China people. While doing so, Mitch has gotten rich. In fact, his China family has given him tens of millions of dollars. Mitch's swamp people are now running false negative ads against me. They are also childishly calling me despicable and mentally ill. The war to drain the swamp and create jobs for West Virginia people has begun. I will beat Joe Manchin and ditch Cocaine Mitch for the sake of the kids.
McConnell, it turns out, had funded ads against Blankenship and reportedly urged President Trump to tell Republicans on Monday not to nominate Blankenship. Not because of the death of 29 miners, not for Blankenship's contempt for government, but because Blankenship was not a real conservative. So, if Mitch McConnell or any other Republicans are wondering how a convicted criminal with no government experience and no respect for government itself got this far, you might want to review your history. In 2000, you, Republicans, nominated the first presidential candidate with a minor criminal record, like his running mate. In 2008, you nominated a candidate who proudly proclaimed he knew nothing about the economy and then picked a running mate who knew even less. In 2012, you nominated a candidate who actively ran away from his government experience and said he was qualified because of his business experience outside government. In 2016, you, the Republicans, nominated the first president in American history with no record whatsoever of public service. Zip, zero, nada. Not the military, not civilian government. Having no experience in government, the Republican Party told us, was better than having some. Last year in Alabama, you nominated a Senate candidate not only accused of sexual misconduct, but who proudly flouted the law multiple times, violating court orders. This year, you applauded the pardon of a sheriff, a law officer convicted of violating another court order. While the president openly calls for illegal actions against his political enemies, the worst Republicans applaud and aid him. The best offer muted words of concern. The majority stay silent. Contempt for government is a slippery slope. The Republican Party has slid down all the way to contempt for the rule of law, dragging the nation with them. But we've been here before. We've been down this path and found our way home again. We will not hit bottom due to you, Mr. President. Whether it's Alabama or West Virginia, I see Americans waking up and looking up and remembering that America's bedrock is respect for law and respect for government, not out of respect for authority, but out of respect for the multitude of voices that speak together as one, as our government, as our laws. That's the America I see. One of President Trump's leading candidates for Secretary of Veterans Affairs turns out to be a lobbyist who's been getting paid to privatize the VA. The man's name is Jeff Miller, the former chairman of the House Veterans Committee. Miller left Congress on January 3rd last year. Less than 5 months later, Miller was a registered lobbyist, getting paid to lobby the government to privatize aspects of veterans' health care. Miller's first client was a disgraced hedge fund billionaire, one Stephen Cohen, who gave President Trump $1 million for his inauguration and who has a chain of clinics that treat veterans and stands to benefit if the government starts spending more of its money on private health care for veterans. Last year, Stephen Cohen spent $290,000 on lobbying for, quote, efforts to increase access to mental health care for veterans and efforts to increase federal funding for PTSD-related research, unquote. Miller was perfectly positioned to work on the issue. As a congressman, Miller helped influence Trump to consider privatizing veterans' health. The law prohibited Miller from lobbying Congress so soon after he left, and his disclosure forms indicate he was doing, quote, executive branch lobbying only. In the first quarter of this year, Stephen Cohen paid the firm Miller works for $50,000. The lobbying disclosure form filed on April 18th shows Miller was still listed as actively lobbying the executive branch, and now Congress, to privatize veterans' health care. Just 2 weeks later, last Wednesday, Miller was meeting with White House aides about the VA position. The previous VA secretary, you should know, says he was pushed out by VA insiders who also want to privatize the VA. One of them, reportedly, Miller's former aide from Congress. I want to be clear that privatizing health care for veterans would be fine if all veterans could get it without going bankrupt, and if private care were somehow both less expensive and better than the VA. We want what is best for our veterans who signed up to service knowing it could mean the ultimate sacrifice. When they return, our meager sacrifice in return is to serve them as best we can. Let's be candid. The VA is far from perfect. Every human system is. But survey after survey indicates the VA is better at providing good care to the most veterans than the private sector, which is obligated to its owners, shareholders, and investors, obligated to provide profits. We, the people, through the tool we call government, have no such obligation. We have a higher obligation, and that means we must choose leaders committed to serving that obligation, not to serving the almighty dollar. Turning to North Korea, does President Trump deserve the credit? We'll talk about it next. I see what we all see. The deep divisions, the endemic injustices, the uncertainty about our future. We have sometimes stumbled. We have sometimes fallen short. But we can renew our national purpose if we recognize that what unites us is far greater and stronger than all that divides us.
Look, we're doing interviews over there at youtube.com/TYT interviews, and we've done some amazing ones recently.
So now, of course, you know the person most widely considered to be the most progressive senator is Bernie Sanders. Yeah. Why not back him during the 2016 primaries? Why be a Democrat at all?
And we're in a time where you cannot, in good conscience, sit on the sidelines of history.
As I should, I'll leave it to the Nobel Committee to decide whether President Trump deserves a Nobel Peace Prize, as many of his followers have been suggesting. But no one should deny it's a good thing that Kim Jong-un has agreed to talks next month. It's terrific that the Korean War may finally come to a formal end, and that Kim has opened the door to scrapping his nukes. But it's important to remember what kind of behavior motivates nations to pursue nuclear weapons in the first place. Consider the lesson offered by North Korea. Kim has obtained nuclear missiles, tested nuclear missiles, threatened to use them, and unleashed outrageous rhetoric. It got him exactly what he wanted: respectful treatment, even praise from the President of the United States, and a place at the table. Which brings us to Iran, and to President Trump's announcement this week about whether to withdraw from the Iran nuclear deal. The president was periodically required to certify Iran's compliance with the terms of that deal. The last time Mr. Trump did so, he said, would be the last, unless, he said, Iran agrees to a new deal, which Iran has said it will not. And the European nations who also signed the deal said they don't need a new one. The White House says Iran is not complying with the terms of the deal, which allow for inspections and threaten the return of sanctions. But here's the thing. Donald Trump scrapping the deal has two consequences. One, it allows the U.S. to restore sanctions against Iran. But in doing so, it also clears the way for the second consequence. Iran can resume its full-out pursuit of nuclear weaponry. In other words, the president pulling out of the Iran deal will help those within Iran who want to get nuclear weapons by eliminating the last reasons for them not to. Iran has seen what happened to Saddam Hussein when he stopped his pursuit of weapons of mass destruction. Iran has seen what happened to Muammar Gaddafi when he agreed to end his nuclear program. Now, contrast those lessons with North Korea. By according Kim Jong-un the respect and recognition he craves in response to Kim's belligerence, President Trump has demonstrated very clearly to Iran and the world that the complexities of diplomacy, compromise, and negotiation are no assurance against American aggression, and that the surest path to winning the respect of America's president is to obtain the only thing he respects: the power to destroy. President Trump's nominee for CIA director, Gina Haspel, who oversaw waterboarding and other brutal torture practices during the George W. Bush administration, got cold feet over the weekend and nearly withdrew her nomination as criticism mounts of her role in one of the darkest chapters in recent American history. 4 senior U.S. officials told the Washington Post that Haspel sought to withdraw on Friday to avoid the spectacle of a raucous confirmation hearing in the Senate set for May 9th. Stunned by the woman's sudden change of heart, several top White House officials rushed to CIA headquarters in Langley, Virginia, where she's currently serving as deputy director, to plead with her that she stay the course. After lengthy deliberations on Saturday, Haspel agreed. A defiant Trump chastised Democrats Monday morning for wanting Haspel out because, quote, she's too tough on terror, unquote. Haspel's so-called, quote, toughness includes overseeing a notorious CIA black site in 2002 when the alleged mastermind of the terror attack on the USS Cole was waterboarded. The CIA also subjected him to tactics both grisly and illegal, including sleep deprivation, rectal force feeding, and extremes of temperature, and others. Haspel later participated in the CIA's destruction of videotapes documenting those sordid acts. All of this is perfectly okay with President Trump, who, recall, boasted on the campaign trail that torture, quote, works, and proclaimed his belief that, quote, waterboarding is fine. Legally, the U.S. has banned the use of torture. But Mr. Trump's nomination of Haspel certainly suggests his enduring commitment to the value of torture, and his rhetorical embrace of it may yet reap political dividends, no matter how thoroughly the tactics have been discredited. Few of those complicit in the global torture regime of President George W. Bush were held accountable. Regardless of Haspel's fate before the Senate, the only consequence here for her is political censure, not the force of law. We as a nation have yet to fully reckon with our collective responsibility for rehabilitating torture as an instrument of American statecraft. Of this, Gina Haspel is but the latest reminder, not the last. Well, with respect, I have a message for Trump voters that they might just listen to under the right conditions. That's coming up in just a moment.
All right, well, the Young Turks special election day coverage dropping.
An amazing power panel.
Look at this panel. You want to talk about power?
Like a smart Destiny's Child.
We're all too strong.
We start a revolution. Yes, another one. Aren't you excited?
Wow. Some of the best writers in the country are right here on this panel, with the obvious exception of John Irola.
Let's not so quickly discount Harry Potter fan fiction.
We have elected the top Twitter troll in the country.
What ran me away from Christianity was judgment and condemnation.
Assaulting peaceful protesters in North Dakota, crazier than bombing Yemen, crazier than bombing Syria so much they ran out of bombs.
Reductive interpretation of what their motives are, what Putin's are, by these amateur experts.
We don't kill our journalists, and they do.
With respect, I'd like to speak for a moment to fans of President Trump, the Fox News viewers, to see whether you're capable of hearing other people fairly without dismissing our substance as a result of our politics. I'd like you to hear a message to President Trump and then decide whether it's safe to dismiss it just because it's coming from me. Here we go. President Trump is fond of calling out the media as fake news, but is he the one giving them very real ammunition? Maybe not intentionally. I'll even give you the benefit of the doubt, Mr. President, and say maybe not deliberately, but consistently, way too consistently. So let me be clear, Mr. President. How can you drain the swamp if you're the one who keeps muddying the waters? You didn't know about that $130,000 payment to a porn star until you did. You said you knew nothing about how your former lawyer, Michael Cohen, handled this until acknowledging you were the guy behind the retainer payment that took care of this. Let's just say your own words on lots of stuff give me lots of pause. Like the time you said the Russians didn't interfere in the 2016 election, until a lot of Republicans had to remind you they did. You came back months later and said, well, I never said that Russia didn't meddle in the election, when in fact you had a lot. It's not that these exaggerations and omissions and misstatements, to say the least, are now and then. More like now and then something else. Always something else. Like you said, there was serious voter fraud in New Hampshire, and there wasn't. And said the same about repeated claims of voter fraud in Virginia, and they weren't. Or that millions of illegals voted in the last election, but they didn't. Your base, your supporters, probably might not care, but you should. I guess you've been too busy draining the swamp to ever stop and smell the stink you are creating. That's your doing. That's your stink, Mr. President. That's your swamp. Okay, so if you're a Trump fan and assume my words must reflect some liberal or otherwise bias, I'd like to again respectfully have you consider the exact same words which we have accepted from part of a commentary by Neil Cavuto of Fox News.
President Trump is fond of calling out the media on fake news, but is he the one giving them very real ammunition? Maybe not intentionally. I'll even give you the benefit of the doubt, Mr. President, and say maybe not deliberately, but consistently, way too consistently. So let me be clear, Mr. President. How can you drain the swamp if you're the one who keeps muddying the waters? You didn't know about that $130,000 payment to a porn star until you did. Said you knew nothing about how your former lawyer, Michael Cohen, handled this until acknowledging today you were the guy behind the retainer payment that took care of this. Let's just say your own words on lots of stuff give me, shall I say, lots of pause. Like the time you said the Russians didn't interfere in the 2016 election until a lot of Republicans had to remind you they did. Came back months later and you said, well, I never said that Russia didn't meddle in the election when, in fact, you had a lot. It is not that these exaggerations and omissions and misstatements are now and then. More like now and then something else. Always something else. Like the time you claimed you signed more bills than any president ever, neglecting to mention the other four presidents, FDR, Truman, Carter, and Clinton, who all signed more. Or brag about the national debt going down by $12 billion after your first month in office, even though it soared by nearly $1 trillion now that you're 15 months in office. Like when you said there was a serious voter fraud in New Hampshire, and there wasn't. Said the same about repeated claims of voter fraud in Virginia, and there weren't. Or that millions of illegals voted in the last election, but they didn't. Your base probably might not care, but you should. I guess you've been too busy draining the swamp to ever stop and smell the stink you're creating. That's your doing. That's your stink. Mr. President, that's your swamp.
If it took hearing that message from Trump supporter Neil Cavuto to make you consider it, if you weigh arguments based not on merit, but on personality, you may be part of the problem. And Mr. Cavuto, if your viewers are incapable of hearing that message from anyone other than Fox News, that's your doing. That's your stink. That's your swamp. What Rudy Giuliani reveals about President Trump after this.
All right, well, the Young Turks special election day coverage dropping.
An amazing power panel.
Look at this panel. You want to talk about power?
Like a smart Destiny's Child.
We're all too strong.
We start a revolution. Yes, another one.
Aren't you excited? Wow. Some of the best writers in the country are right here on this panel, with the obvious exception of John Iadarola.
Let's not so quickly discount Harry Potter fan fiction.
We have elected the top Twitter troll in the country.
What ran me away from Christianity was judgment and condemnation.
Assaulting peaceful protesters in North Dakota, crazier than bombing Yemen, crazier than bombing Syria so much they ran out of bombs.
Reductive interpretation of what their motives are, what Putin's are, by these amateur experts is just beyond.
We don't kill our journalists, and they do.
Finally tonight, when you look at the performance of Rudy Giuliani these past few days, it's hard to construct a coherent theory that explains it. He is supposed to be President Trump's lawyer and advocate, but is demolishing rather than building the president's legal case. So we have to consider the possibility then that Giuliani is being deployed to assist the president's political survival, to muddy the waters, to drag out debate, to wear us all out. In which case, mission somewhat accomplished. It's important also to consider Giuliani's performance in the broader context of Trump's performance. Fair-minded people have to ask, how could one of America's top businessmen do so poorly as president? How could one of America's top prosecutors do so poorly defending him? And how could so many Americans defend the performances of both? We, as a country, as a society, have struggled with some of these questions since before Mr. Trump won the nomination, and we're still struggling with them. Economic anxiety is part of the answer. Economic anxiety coupled with concerns about rapid changes in the nation's overall culture, fueled by dramatic demographic changes, the increases in the racial makeup of immigrants, more Latinos, Africans, Arabs, and Asians. Concern, often outright fears, and yes, some blatant racism is part of the heart of this. Americans, especially white Americans, were loath to contemplate the role of racial concerns, especially plain straight-out racism, in elevating a man such as Mr. Trump. But as much as we hate to face it, the evidence is mounting. Mr. Trump's support levels remain stubbornly fixed. Indeed, by some estimates, they're at least slightly increasing. There is no guarantee that Trump's party, and it is his party now, will lose control of one of the houses of Congress in November, much less two. Recognizing that racial bias and, in too many cases, deep, abiding racism are at the core of many of our national problems. That's a necessary first step to recognize that, and one that we have not yet fully taken. Until we do, trying to understand the rise of Donald Trump and what is happening in our country will continue to confound us. With that, I leave you for this news cycle. The Young Turks is next, and we'll be back with the news at this same place and time, 5:30 Eastern, every Monday. Until then, Dan Rather reporting. Stay steady.
I see what we all see. The deep divisions, the endemic injustices, the uncertainty about our future. We have sometimes stumbled. We have sometimes fallen short. But we can renew our national purpose if we recognize that what unites us is far greater and stronger than all that divides us.
Look, we're doing interviews over there at youtube.com/TYT interviews, and we've done some amazing ones recently.
So now, of course, you know the person most widely considered to be the most progressive senator is Bernie Sanders.
Yeah.
Why not back him during the 2016 primaries?
Why be a Democrat at all? And we're in a time where you cannot, in good conscience, sit on the sidelines of history.